Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Invisible Patient.
I'll never forget the first time I noticed something strange about room 209. It was an uneventful night shift in the ER, the kind that drags on in eerie silence, interrupted only by the hum of machines and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. Most of the beds were empty, save for a couple of patients who were asleep or dozing off. Around 3 in the morning, I sat at the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I noticed something odd on the system screen. Room 209 was marked as occupied. At first, I figured it was a simple glitch, the kind that happens when a patient gets discharged and the system doesn't update properly. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. I had been up and down those halls all night, and I knew for a fact that room 209 was empty. No one had been admitted there for days. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. As I approached room 209, a strange feeling settled over me, that creeping unease you get when you're alone in the dark. The hall was dead quiet, the silence pressing in on all sides. I reached for the doorknob, feeling a chill that seemed to seep from the metal into my skin. Taking a breath, I opened the door slowly, half expecting to find someone sitting there. But the room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets crisp and untouched. The monitors beside the bed were off, casting shadows on the wall. Everything was as it should be, except that the air in the room felt heavy. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if something was lingering, something I couldn't see. I shook it off, deciding it was just my imagination running wild from too many night shifts. I returned to the nurse's station and tried to reset the system, hoping that would clear the occupied marker. But every time I refreshed the screen, room 209 remained highlighted in red. I glanced down the hall, the door to room 209 barely visible in the dim light. It felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to come back. The next night, I returned for another shift, still uneasy about what had happened with room 209. The moment I stepped into the ER, the memory of that empty room nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I joined my colleagues, exchanging the usual pleasantries and complaints about the long hours, but a tension hung in the air, almost palpable. As my shift wore on, I couldn't focus on my duties. I kept glancing at the computer, waiting for that red marker to appear again. I overheard some nurses talking in hushed voices, their expressions serious. I caught snippets of their conversation about seeing something in the cameras, a fleeting shadow or a figure, just a blur at the edge of the screen. "Did you see it too?" one nurse asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I swear I saw someone lying in that bed last night." My heart raced. I had to know what they were talking about. After my rounds, I approached the tech who monitored the security cameras. "Can you pull up the footage from room 209? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, eyebrows raised, clearly taken aback. "You saw something?" "Because I've seen it too," he replied, glancing around as if he was afraid someone else might overhear. I thought it was just me. The video feed flickered on the screen, and we both leaned closer. I felt my breath hitch as I focused on the grainy footage. At first, it looked normal, an empty room. But then, just for a moment, a dark shape flitted across the bed. Too quick to identify, too real to ignore. My heart pounded in my chest. I was sure I saw the outline of a figure, lying motionless under the blankets. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, a chill racing down my spine. The tech shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't know. It's like the room is haunted or something. I've seen it multiple times now, but when I go to check, it's always empty." That night, I found myself staring at the door of room 209, knowing something was there, waiting for someone to notice it. My mind raced with questions. Who was in that bed? Why was their presence lingering here? The feeling of being watched grew stronger, the air heavier with each passing minute. Later, while making my rounds, I couldn't resist the urge to check on room 209 again. I approached the door, feeling the same cold chill wash over me as before. I gripped the doorknob tightly, bracing myself. The moment I pushed the door open, my heart dropped. The bed was empty, but the feeling of someone watching me was almost overwhelming. I turned to leave, but I could have sworn I heard a soft whimper coming from the corner of the room. My skin prickled as I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response came, just the oppressive silence of the empty room. As I stepped back into the hallway, my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. What did this presence want? And why was it targeting the staff? I had to find out, before whatever it was turned its attention toward me. The following days felt like a waking nightmare. I barely slept, the weight of room 209 hanging over me like a storm cloud. The other nurses had begun to share their own experiences, stories that fueled my unease. One night, a seasoned nurse named Carol pulled me aside, her face pale and drawn. "You need to be careful, Sarah," she said, her voice low and shaky. "I heard that a patient died in that room years ago. It's always been a bit strange since then." "Died? In room 209? I asked, my throat tightening. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "They didn't want to scare the new nurses," she replied, glancing around nervously. "But I've seen things in there that I can't explain. Shadows moving when there's no one there. It's like the room is alive." I felt a chill wash over me, my mind racing. Had I been sensing the presence of a ghost all along? The thought made my stomach churn. I had to know more about this patient. There had to be records, something that could shed light on what was happening. After my shift, I made my way to the hospital's archives. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I rifled through files, searching for anything related to room 209. Minutes turned into hours, and just as I was about to give up, I found it. A dusty file tucked away in the corner labeled Patient History, Room 209. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding. The details were grim. The patient had been a young boy named Tommy, admitted after a tragic car accident that claimed his mother's life. The report stated that the mother had arrived too late, her desperate cries echoing through the emergency room as they tried to save her son. Tommy passed away that night, and the report noted that his mother had been inconsolable, her grief palpable. Tears prickled at my eyes as I read the final line. Patient never left the facility. He is believed to have an unresolved attachment to this room. I closed the file, shaking. It all made sense now. Tommy wasn't just a ghost. He was a lost child seeking his mother. But why was he lingering in the room? Did he not realize he was gone? My mind was spinning with possibilities. I needed to help him, to somehow bring peace to this tragic situation. The next night, I stood outside room 209, heart racing. The door loomed before me, and I could feel the cold air seeping out from the crack beneath it. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, determined to make contact with whatever presence was inside. "Tommy," I called, my voice trembling. "I'm here to help you." Silence hung in the air. I stepped into the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of the boy. The monitors were off, but the weight of the atmosphere pressed down on me. "If you're here, you can trust me," I continued. "I know what happened to you. I want to help you find your mother." As I spoke, the temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Suddenly, I heard a soft whimper, like the sound of a child crying. It sent chills down my spine, but I stood my ground, heart racing. "It's okay, Tommy. I'm not here to hurt you." Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a fleeting shadow dart across the room. I turned quickly, but it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. "Please, don't be scared. I'm here to listen," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. The air thickened, and a small, ethereal figure began to take shape at the foot of the bed. I blinked in disbelief, feeling both terrified and oddly comforted. "Tommy," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked at me, his face blurred and indistinct, but I could sense his sadness, his longing. I took a cautious step closer, desperate to reach him. "I know you're looking for your mother. Can you show me what you need?" And in that moment, as the room swirled with shadows, I felt the chilling grip of fear tighten around me, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The moment Tommy's shadowy form flickered before me, my heart raced. I could barely breathe, the air thick with tension and unfulfilled longing. I took a step closer, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tommy, can you show me what you need? I want to help you find your mother." For a fleeting second, I thought I saw him nod. The air felt charged with energy, and the temperature continued to plummet. I could almost feel his sorrow, an echo of pain that twisted around my heart. I was no longer just a nurse. I was a bridge between this lost child and his mother, and I could feel the urgency pressing down on me. Suddenly, the monitors flickered to life, the beeping sounds of heart rates and breathing machines piercing the silence. I jumped back, my heart racing. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The lights dimmed, and I felt a presence gathering strength in the room. I could hear whispers, barely audible at first, but growing clearer. They were muffled and desperate, the sound of a child's voice calling for help. "Mommy! Mommy!" The cries echoed in my mind, each one sharper than the last. "Tommy!" I shouted, overwhelmed. "Where is she? Where can I find her?" As if responding to my plea, the atmosphere shifted again. The air around me seemed to swirl, drawing my attention to the corner of the room where shadows danced like restless spirits. I squinted, trying to make sense of the movement, when I suddenly felt a surge of cold wash over me. In an instant, the shadow of a woman appeared beside Tommy's figure, her face shrouded in darkness, but I could see the anguish etched on her features. "Mom!" I gasped, stepping back instinctively. The apparition felt so real, yet so out of reach. The woman's hands reached toward her child, but there was a barrier between them, a barrier that felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Please," I urged, desperation clawing at me. "You need to let him go. He's waiting for you, but he doesn't know you're gone." The mother's face contorted with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. "I didn't reach him in time," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I couldn't save him. I'm so sorry, Tommy." Tears streamed down my face as I watched the heartbreak unfold before me. The realization hit me hard. This was not just about a lost child, it was about a mother's unbearable grief. I had to find a way to connect them, to help them understand that it was okay to let go. "Tommy," I said, my voice shaking but resolute, "your mother is here. She's been waiting for you, just as you've been waiting for her. You need to help her find peace. It's okay to move on." The shadowy figures exchanged a look filled with longing and despair. Tommy's eyes, though obscured, glistened with hope. "I want to go home," he whispered, the weight of his sorrow palpable. The room trembled with emotion, and I felt an overwhelming surge of energy ripple through me. I knew I had to act quickly. "Mom, you have to tell him it's okay," I cried out, my heart racing. "He needs to hear you say it." The mother took a hesitant step forward, her form flickering in and out of focus. "Tommy, my sweet boy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I love you, and I want you to be free. You don't have to wait for me anymore. It's time for you to go home." As her words hung in the air, I watched as the shadows around them began to swirl, drawing closer together. The moment felt monumental, charged with the energy of 1,000 unspoken words. "Let go, Tommy. It's okay," I encouraged, feeling tears stream down my cheeks. In that instant, I felt a wave of warmth flood the room, and the shadows began to dissolve, merging into one another. I reached out, feeling a strange pull, as if something deep within me connected to their shared sorrow. "You can be together again, in a different way," I said, my voice breaking. Tommy's figure began to fade, a serene smile breaking through the sorrow on his face. "I love you, Mommy," he whispered, and in that moment, he stepped closer to her. The mother's hands reached out, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her presence as they embraced, dissolving into light. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight that had lingered for so long began to lift. I stood there, breathless, feeling as if a heavy curtain had been drawn back, revealing a warmth I hadn't felt before. In that instant, I realized that I had borne witness to something extraordinary, a moment of closure, of love transcending even death. But as the silence enveloped me, I couldn't shake the feeling that although this chapter had closed, the story of Room 209 was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and haunting echoes of what I had witnessed in Room 209. The monitors continued to beep, and the bustle of the hospital carried on as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. I had felt the weight of that sorrow and the release of a love that defied even the bounds of death. Yet, despite the apparent calm, an unsettling atmosphere lingered in the hospital. Other nurses and staff began to whisper about strange occurrences, murmurs of figures seen flitting in and out of rooms, shadows that moved with an almost sentient awareness. They spoke of feelings of being watched, of cold drafts brushing against their skin, and it filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. One evening, as I was preparing for my shift, I received a call from the night supervisor, asking me to check on room 209. My heart raced at the thought. What could possibly be happening there now? I steeled myself, hoping that whatever presence had once haunted that space had truly found peace. As I stepped into the room, a sense of calm washed over me, but it was tinged with an unsettling familiarity. The bed was empty, but the air felt charged, as if it were holding its breath. I could almost hear the whispers again, the faint echoes of Tommy and his mother, the unresolved emotions that had lingered long after their departure. I turned to leave when a flicker in the corner of my eye caught my attention. The curtain by the window swayed, though there was no breeze. My heart raced, and I hesitated. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, I felt a pull, as if something deep within the room was beckoning me closer. With trepidation, I approached the bed, my eyes scanning the area. That's when I noticed it, a small toy lying on the floor, one I recognized from the day I had seen Tommy. It was a little blue truck, its paint chipped and faded, but the memories it held were vivid in my mind. Picking it up, I felt a shiver run down my spine. This toy had been a part of Tommy's world, and now it felt like a bridge to the past. I glanced around, half expecting to see a shadow flicker past me, but instead, I was met with stillness. Yet, a sense of determination surged within me. I needed to return this to him, to honor his memory. That night, I took the toy and found myself drawn back to the waiting area of the emergency room. It felt right, as if that's where Tommy would have been, waiting for his mother. I placed the toy on one of the chairs and took a step back, heart pounding. "Tommy," I whispered, "if you're here, know that I haven't forgotten you. Your mother loved you, and you deserve to be remembered." For a brief moment, I felt a warmth envelop me, as if someone had wrapped their arms around me in a comforting embrace. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, feeling the air thrum with emotion. I opened my eyes again, and there, for a fleeting second, I saw a shadow, a small boy's figure standing by the toy truck, his face illuminated with a radiant smile. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the vision faded. But I could feel it. The heaviness in the air had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that felt like a warm embrace. I left the emergency room that night, feeling a newfound lightness in my heart. The invisible threads of connection that bound us all, those living and those lost, reminded me of the power of love and the enduring nature of our memories. As I walked through the empty hallways, I realized that the stories we carry and the connections we forge don't simply end. They evolve, becoming part of something greater. I might never know what happened to Tommy and his mother after that night, but I took solace in the belief that they had found each other once more. And as I turned the corner to leave the ward, I swore I heard the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing behind me.
The final visit.
I never thought I would be the type to believe in ghosts. After nearly a decade working in the emergency room at a bustling hospital in Chicago, I prided myself on being a rational man. I was surrounded by the harsh realities of life and death, each night blurring into the next, filled with the sounds of beeping monitors and frantic footsteps. I believed in science, in facts, in what I could see and measure. But that was before I started hearing the whispers of the dying. It was a typical Tuesday night when it all began. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting an unflattering glare on the sterile surfaces of the ER. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, and the faint aroma of burnt coffee wafted from the nurse's station. I was just wrapping up my rounds when I first encountered her, Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly woman who had been admitted after a fall. Her frail body lay motionless on the gurney, but her eyes were wide, reflecting an unnerving mixture of fear and resignation. "Doctor, please," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "He's here." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued yet skeptical. "Who's here, Mrs. Whitaker?" "The man in black," she said, her gaze drifting toward the far corner of the room. "He's watching me. I can feel him." A chill raced down my spine, but I quickly masked my discomfort with professionalism. "That's just the medication talking, Mrs. Whitaker. You're safe here." But she wasn't convinced. "No, you don't understand. He's come for me. I see him every time I close my eyes." The atmosphere in the room shifted. It felt suddenly colder, and as I glanced toward the corner where she was looking, I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving just out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but nothing was there, just the sterile walls and the blinking machines. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, I began to hear similar accounts from other patients. They spoke of visions, dark figures lurking just beyond their sight, always there, always watching. My skepticism wavered, but I dismissed it as mere delusion brought on by pain or medication. A few days later, Mrs. Whitaker passed away, just as she had predicted. Her haunting words echoed in my mind. "He's here." It was just the beginning. The figure became a legend whispered among the staff and patients alike, referred to as the final visitor. Each story fed my skepticism, yet deep down, a sense of dread began to take root in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my patients and the chaos of the ER, but the tales continued to weave themselves into the fabric of my reality. I couldn't help but wonder what was really happening in that room. Who, or what, was this figure watching from the shadows? My heart raced as the questions swirled in my mind, pulling me into a dark spiral of curiosity and fear. Little did I know that soon I would be confronted by something far more chilling than mere superstition. Days turned into weeks, and the stories surrounding the final visitor only grew more unsettling. I found myself increasingly haunted by Mrs. Whitaker's last words. Each time I entered the emergency room, I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, a constant reminder of the patients who had seen something I hadn't. I could almost sense eyes watching me, hidden in the shadows of the brightly lit room. One evening, while I was on shift, I was taking a break in the staff lounge, scrolling through my phone when I overheard two nurses discussing another incident involving the elusive figure. "She was screaming," one of them said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She kept saying, 'He's coming for me,' and then, just like that, she was gone." "What do you think it is?" the other nurse replied, her tone equal parts fear and intrigue. "Some kind of death omen." I felt a rush of irritation. "It's just a coincidence," I interjected, unable to keep my skepticism to myself. Patients are often disoriented and frightened in their final moments. They see things that aren't there. The first nurse shot me a look, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But it's always the same figure. How do you explain that?" I sighed, feeling the need to defend my logic. "There's no evidence of any kind of paranormal activity. It's just people's imaginations running wild in a stressful environment." But even as I said the words, I couldn't help but remember that fleeting shadow in the corner of the room, the moment when I felt an unsettling presence lurking just out of view. My resolve started to waver, and I decided it was time to investigate for myself. The next night, I brought a small handheld camera to work, intending to capture any anomalies. My plan was to document everything I could and debunk this myth once and for all. The emergency room was quieter than usual, the calm before the storm, and I set up the camera at the far end of the ward, aiming it toward the corner where the figure had supposedly been spotted. As the night dragged on, I watched the monitors, listened to the distant sounds of patients murmuring in their sleep, and waited. Hours passed, and I began to feel foolish. Was I really sitting in an empty ER, waiting for a ghost? Just as I was about to give up, I heard a faint rustling noise coming from the hallway. Curious, I got up to investigate, leaving my camera rolling. I stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously above me. As I walked, I noticed that the temperature seemed to drop. My breath became visible, and an inexplicable shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, like the sound of a breeze slipping through the trees, but it felt distinctly human. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response. I turned to leave, but out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was just a silhouette, but the shape seemed to loom, watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. As I took a step forward, the figure vanished, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness. I rushed back to the ER, my pulse racing. Had I really seen something, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I needed to review the footage from my camera. When I returned to the lounge, I grabbed my camera, trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. I played back the recording, my heart racing as I searched for any signs of what I had witnessed. To my shock, just before the screen flickered to black, there was a brief glimpse of something, an outline, a shadow moving in the corner of the frame. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't just my imagination, but just as quickly as I saw it, it was gone. The camera had caught something that shouldn't have existed, a presence that haunted my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that this investigation was only leading me deeper into a darkness I was not prepared to confront. As I sat there in disbelief, I realized that the final visitor was not just a myth. It was something real, and it wanted to be seen. The haunting silhouette I glimpsed on my camera replay haunted me for days. My skepticism was crumbling under the weight of the evidence, and I felt a deep compulsion to uncover the truth about the entity that had taken residence in our emergency room. I decided to do some digging into the hospital's past, hoping to find any records that could explain the presence of the final visitor. One afternoon, I took a break from my shifts to visit the hospital archives. The musty smell of old paper hung in the air as I sifted through dusty files, searching for anything that might connect our current patients with the mysterious figure. I came across a file labeled "Mysterious Deaths in the ER," and my heart raced. As I flipped through the pages, I found reports from several decades ago, patients who had passed away unexpectedly, often in the very room where I had seen the figure. One name stood out: Samuel Grant. According to the records, Samuel was a young boy who had been brought into the ER after a tragic accident. His mother had been delayed in traffic, arriving just moments too late to see him alive. The reports detailed how he had died on the operating table, a victim of fate and time. As I read on, I found a chilling entry dated a few weeks after Samuel's death. It recounted how staff members had begun to report seeing a small boy in a hospital gown wandering the halls, his face pale and lost. The reports stopped abruptly, suggesting the sightings had been hushed up, buried alongside the boy's tragic story. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was this the same child that Mrs. Whitaker had seen? My thoughts raced as I connected the dots. Samuel had been waiting for his mother, just as the other patients had claimed to see the figure watching them, waiting for something or someone. It felt like the room was starting to breathe, the weight of grief and longing suffocating. With this new information, I returned to the ER that night, determined to confront the truth. I set up my camera again, this time focusing on the corner where Samuel had reportedly appeared. As the hours passed, the usual hum of the ER took on an eerie quality. Each beep from the monitors felt amplified, every whispered conversation carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before. Around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. I felt it in my bones, the air thickening, charged with anticipation. Suddenly, I heard the soft sound of footsteps, the familiar rhythm of tiny feet padding across the floor. My heart raced as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just empty beds and the glow of monitors. "Samuel," I called softly, my voice trembling. "Are you here?" Silence enveloped me, but just as I was about to dismiss my fears, I noticed a small, shadowy figure in the corner of my eye. I spun around, and there he was, a young boy in a hospital gown, his face pale and expressionless. My heart dropped as I realized I was witnessing the apparition myself. "Please," he said, his voice a mere whisper, "help me find my mom." The sadness in his eyes pierced through me, and I took a cautious step closer. "Samuel, I want to help you." "But how?" He pointed toward the hallway, his gaze unwavering. "She's close, but she can't see me. I want to go home." My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just a ghostly figure. It was a child filled with longing and despair. The realization washed over me like a cold wave. I was not just an observer. I had become part of this tragic story. The little boy was trapped between this world and the next, waiting for the one person he had lost. Suddenly, the lights flickered overhead, drawing my attention. I looked back at him, but he was gone, leaving only the chill of his presence lingering in the air. I rushed to the nurse's station, my mind racing. I had to find out more about Samuel's mother and what had happened after that tragic night. As I delved into the records, my determination to resolve this ghostly mystery grew stronger. The more I unearthed about Samuel's past, the more I felt compelled to bring closure to his pain. The lines between life and death were blurring, and I knew that this was far more than just a medical case. It was a quest for understanding, a desperate need to heal the wounds of the past. The ER felt different now. More than just a place of healing, it had become a battleground for souls trapped in their sorrow. And I was determined to confront whatever dark forces lay waiting, seeking peace for a child lost to time. I spent the following days in a whirlwind of fear and determination. Each shift in the ER felt heavier than the last, as I grappled with the weight of what I had witnessed. Samuel's plea echoed in my mind. "Help me find my mom." I could no longer ignore the reality of the haunting that had taken root in our emergency room. I needed answers. The hospital had a counseling department that dealt with grief, and I hoped they might have some leads on Samuel's mother. After an exhausting night shift, I reached out to Clara, a grief counselor who had been at the hospital for years. She had a reputation for her compassion and understanding when it came to loss, and I needed her expertise now more than ever. As we sat in her small office, surrounded by shelves of comforting books and plants, I explained everything: the sightings, the figure in black, and my encounter with Samuel. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowing with concern. "I've heard whispers of something like this," she said slowly. "The idea of a lingering spirit connected to unresolved grief. It's not uncommon in hospitals, especially when someone passes unexpectedly." "But what can I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "He's looking for his mother. I need to help him. Perhaps we can find out what happened to her," Sarah suggested. "If we can uncover her story, we might be able to bring some closure to him." We began our investigation, sifting through old hospital records, searching for any mention of Samuel's mother. It wasn't long before we discovered her name, Clara Grant. She had been frantic when she arrived, but the records indicated that she had left shortly after Samuel's passing, devastated and broken. Her contact information was outdated, but Sarah suggested we could try reaching out to local support groups for grieving parents. Maybe Clara had found solace in one of them. After a long day of searching, we finally located a group that Clara had attended, and I decided to go in person. My heart raced as I made my way to the community center that hosted the meetings. What if Clara didn't want to talk about her past? What if she didn't even remember Samuel? The room was filled with people sharing their stories of loss, and I stood at the door, feeling out of place. I introduced myself to the facilitator and explained my purpose. After a moment of hesitation, she led me to a corner where a woman sat, her eyes puffy and red-rimmed, clutching a small teddy bear. "Clara, this is a nurse from the hospital," the facilitator said gently. "She's here to talk to you about your son." I took a deep breath, my heart aching for the woman who had lost so much. "Clara, I know this is difficult, but I believe your son, Samuel, is still trying to reach you." Her gaze shifted, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. "Samuel," she whispered, and her eyes filled with tears. "Samuel was a patient at the hospital," I continued, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "He's been seen by staff, and he's waiting for you. He wants to go home." Clara's face crumpled as the reality hit her. "I thought he was gone forever. I thought I lost him." "No, he's still here, waiting for you to see him," I urged, feeling the urgency in my heart. "He's trapped, and I believe he needs your help to find peace." In that moment, a connection sparked between us, a thread of shared grief and understanding. Clara nodded, the weight of her sorrow palpable. I never got to say goodbye. I was so late. I thought if I just could have made it. "Samuel needs you to know it's okay," I said softly. "You both deserve to find closure." We agreed to return to the hospital together that night. As we made our way back, Clara's eyes were distant, lost in the memories of her son. I could feel Samuel's presence growing stronger, the urgency palpable as we stepped into the ER. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she approached the familiar area where her son had taken his last breath. "I'm so sorry, Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have been here." I watched as she spoke, her words hanging in the air like a lifeline. I could feel the atmosphere shift, charged with emotion. In that moment, I understood that this was a profound connection, between mother and child, between life and death. "Samuel, if you're here," I said, my voice echoing softly, "your mom is with you now. She's ready to help you find peace." And then it happened. The lights flickered, and I saw the shadow in the corner, the small figure emerging from the darkness. Samuel stood before us, looking as lost as ever, but now there was something different in his gaze, a glimmer of hope. Clara fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she reached out toward him. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry," she cried. "I love you. I'm here now." The figure took a step forward, and I felt an overwhelming wave of energy wash over me. It was as if the very essence of their bond had illuminated the room. I stood back, allowing them to reconnect, and in that moment, I knew we were witnessing something extraordinary. As the light in the room grew brighter, I understood that this was not just a farewell, it was a homecoming. Samuel, the lost boy, had finally found his way back to his mother, and together they were stepping into the light. The ER transformed around me, the oppressive weight lifting as the shadows began to fade. I felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude, a deep understanding that even in the face of darkness, love could bridge the divide between life and death. The encounter had changed everything, but as I looked around the now peaceful emergency room, I knew this was just the beginning of my journey, a journey into the unknown, where hope and healing intertwined with the echoes of loss. The following days felt surreal. The weight that had hung over the ER seemed to lift, replaced by a strange calm. Clara and Samuel's reunion had been a powerful moment, one that shifted the very fabric of our reality. I still could hardly believe what I had witnessed. The figure in black, the whispers of patience, the sense of foreboding, it all felt like a chapter closing, a mystery unraveling in a way I had never anticipated. Clara came back to the hospital several times after that night. Each time, she would sit quietly in the waiting area, her presence calming, a gentle reminder of the connection she had forged with her son. She would often bring flowers, setting them in the corner where Samuel had been seen, and I would catch glimpses of her smiling softly, as if she could still feel his spirit beside her. I started to notice a change in the ER staff as well. The stories of the figure in black had circulated among the nurses and doctors, but after Clara's visits, the atmosphere shifted from fear to a sense of understanding. Many of us began to speak about the importance of connection, of not ignoring the emotional weight that each patient carried. It was as if Samuel's story had woven its way into the very heart of our team, prompting us to treat each person with even more compassion. But there was still a lingering unease within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery wasn't entirely resolved. Why had Samuel been left behind? What about the other patients who had seen the figure? I spent nights going over old records, looking for any connection, any clue that could explain the presence we had encountered. One evening, while sorting through files in the storage room, I came across an old journal belonging to Dr. Hayes, a physician who had worked in the ER decades ago. As I flipped through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The entries described similar occurrences, patients who spoke of seeing a figure in black, often just before they passed away. The final entry, written in an unsteady hand, sent shivers through me. Asterisk, I can no longer ignore what I've seen. The figure appears when someone is about to leave this world, a guide or perhaps a warning. I fear that I have failed to protect my patients from this presence. I must find a way to confront it before it's too late. Asterisk. I felt a rush of adrenaline, the pieces of a puzzle clicking together. Dr. Hayes had tried to understand the figure, but had ultimately failed. I wondered if he had ever confronted it, or if he had simply given up in despair. Either way, it was clear that this was not the first time someone had encountered this being, and perhaps it wouldn't be the last. Driven by a sense of urgency, I decided to gather the staff for a meeting. They needed to know what I had discovered, what had transpired with Clara and Samuel, and the history that had woven itself into the very fabric of our hospital. As we sat in the break room, I shared everything: the haunting stories, Clara's reunion, and Dr. Hayes' journal. I watched as their faces shifted from skepticism to concern, and then to a resolve to understand. It was clear that we needed to acknowledge this presence, to confront it rather than fear it. Together, we formulated a plan. We would hold a small gathering in the ER late at night, a sort of vigil where we could honor those we had lost, those who had seen the figure, and those who had passed without closure. Clara agreed to come, her strength bolstering our spirits. I hoped that by creating this space, we could finally lay the lingering fears to rest. The night of the vigil arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. We decorated the room with candles and flowers, each nurse and doctor taking a moment to reflect on a patient they had lost. Clara stood at the forefront, a beacon of hope in the dimly lit room. Her presence felt like a bridge, connecting us to those who had passed. As we began to share our stories, something shifted in the atmosphere. The room grew colder, and a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned, heart racing, and there it was, the figure in black, watching us from the corner. It didn't feel menacing, though. Rather, it felt as if it were waiting, listening. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "I know you're here," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We're not afraid anymore. We're here to remember, to honor those who have passed." Please, guide them home." A hush fell over the room as the figure slowly began to dissipate, transforming into a soft light that enveloped us. I could feel a warmth spreading through my chest, a sense of peace washing over the vigil. It was as if the weight of grief was lifted, a release that had been long overdue. In that moment, I understood that the figure wasn't a harbinger of death. It was a guardian, a guide for souls lost in the liminal space between life and death. Samuel and Clara had shown us that love and connection could transcend even the darkest of moments. As the light faded and the room returned to normal, I realized we had done more than confront our fears. We had forged a bond, not just among ourselves, but with those we had lost. The ER had transformed from a place of sorrow into a sanctuary of healing, where stories of loss became stories of connection. From that night forward, I carried Samuel's story with me, a reminder that even in the face of death, there is always hope. I became an advocate for those still navigating the painful journey of grief, determined to ensure that no one would feel alone in their final moments. Together, we would honor the lives lost and embrace the healing power of love, even in the darkest corners of the human experience.
The Lost Child.
It was a typical night shift in the emergency room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the waiting area, and the quiet was only broken by the occasional murmur of a patient or the beeping of machines down the hall. I was used to these hours, the stillness, the empty chairs, the shadows that crept in from the edges of the poorly lit rooms. But that night, something felt different. The silence seemed heavier, almost stifling, like something unseen had settled over the place. Around 2 in the morning, just as I was finishing my rounds, I saw him for the first time. He was standing in the corner of the waiting area, half hidden by shadows, staring at the floor. At first, I thought he was one of the night visitors waiting for news about a loved one, or maybe a child from pediatrics who'd wandered off. He looked about 8, maybe 9, with dark, messy hair and a pale face that seemed streaked with tears. I took a hesitant step forward, trying not to startle him. "Hey there," I said softly, trying to sound comforting. "Are you lost?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched and his little fists clenched at his sides. Something about him looked wrong. The more I looked, the more I felt my stomach tighten. His skin was almost too pale, his clothes oddly old-fashioned, like he'd stepped out of a different time. "Do you need help?" I asked again, moving closer, but the moment I blinked, he was gone. Just gone. The corner was empty, not even a shadow where he'd stood. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself staring at the empty space, wondering if I'd imagined him. Exhaustion could do strange things, especially on these long shifts. But I felt this cold prickle of dread creep up my spine, the feeling that I was being watched, like his gaze was still on me, even though he wasn't there. I shook it off, chalking it up to lack of sleep, but the image of that boy's face haunted me for the rest of the night. His pale skin, the tear tracks down his cheeks, the look of fear that seemed to linger in his eyes. It all felt too real. Even as I tried to brush it off, something about him gnawed at me, a nagging feeling I couldn't quite shake. As I clocked out that morning, the first light of dawn breaking over the hospital's parking lot, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Just another oddity of the night shift. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I tried to forget about the boy. After all, people see strange things on the night shift, especially after too many hours and too little sleep. But he didn't let me forget him. A few nights after that first sighting, he came back. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I saw him again. I was filling out some paperwork, lost in the monotonous rhythm of signing and checking boxes, when I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the same corner, almost hidden in the shadows, just like before. He looked exactly the same, down to the faint smudges of dirt on his cheek and the wide, frightened look in his eyes. My chest tightened, a feeling of dread settling deep in my stomach. I was sure I hadn't imagined him the first time, but seeing him again, it felt wrong, ghostly. Swallowing hard, I stood up slowly and took a step toward him. "Hey, buddy," I called, my voice shaky. "Are you lost? Can I help you find someone?" Just like before, he didn't answer. He didn't even move, except for his eyes, which seemed to flicker with a strange, silent fear. I took another step closer, and as I reached my hand out, he vanished. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone, leaving nothing but an eerie emptiness where he'd stood. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, staring at the empty corner. How could he disappear like that? It was impossible. But the dread was there, creeping into my bones, telling me that I'd just witnessed something I couldn't explain. I didn't mention it to anyone. Not that night, at least. But it kept happening. Every few nights, I'd catch a glimpse of him, just standing there, watching me, always in the same place, always with that same look of fear. Each time, he disappeared the moment I tried to approach him, like he was slipping away from me on purpose. I started asking my co-workers, carefully, if they'd noticed anything strange. Just casual questions at first, things like, "Have you seen any kids wandering around here at night?" But nobody else seemed to know what I was talking about. They laughed it off, saying I was probably tired, imagining things. But I knew what I'd seen. I could still feel his eyes on me, even when he wasn't there. Soon, the sightings started messing with my sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about him, picturing his little face every time I closed my eyes. And then there was this other thing. I started hearing whispers. Soft, faint, like a voice carried by the breeze. Always when I passed the waiting area at night, I'd hear a quiet, desperate whisper that sounded almost like my name, Emily. At first, I convinced myself it was just the hum of the vents or the shuffle of papers in a nearby office. But the whisper became clearer, more deliberate, almost pleading, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was terrified. I wanted to run every time I passed that corner, but something kept me rooted in place, like I had to listen, even if I didn't want to. One night, when the whisper was especially strong, I finally whispered back, my voice barely audible, "What do you want?" There was no answer, just the cold silence and that empty, dark corner. But somehow I knew. He was trying to tell me something. The boy had wormed his way into every part of my life. I'd be driving home, looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face staring back at me. I couldn't sleep without hearing those faint whispers echoing in my mind, and when I finally did drift off, he haunted my dreams, standing in that same shadowed corner, his mouth moving as if he were trying to speak, but no sound ever came out. It was like he was trapped in a silent scream. One night, after another sighting that left me rattled, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. My curiosity, or maybe my desperation, drove me to search the hospital's archives. It took some persuading to get access to the records, but eventually I convinced one of the receptionists to let me dig through some of the older files. I spent hours flipping through dusty folders and faded documents, my fingers trembling each time I thought I'd found something. And then, buried in a stack of yellowed newspapers from years ago, I found it. A report about a little boy who had died in our ER under tragic circumstances. His name was Jacob. He'd been in a terrible car accident while his mother was rushing to bring him to the hospital, but she didn't make it in time. He passed away here, in this very building, waiting for her to come save him. I felt a hollow ache spread through me as I read the details. Jacob had been only 8 years old, the same age as the boy I kept seeing. My heart twisted painfully, and I felt this sudden, intense wave of sadness. The look in his eyes made sense now. That quiet, desperate fear. He'd been waiting, just waiting for someone to come help him, and no one ever did. As I sat there, piecing together the tragic story, a chill ran through me. It was like the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. I felt this cold, heavy presence settle around me, and instinctively, I knew he was there, watching me. Not as a threat, but as a plea. He needed something from me, needed me to help him in a way no one else had. My hands shook as I put the file down. I whispered, as if he could hear me, "Jacob, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." My voice was barely audible, but somehow, speaking his name aloud made everything feel real. He wasn't just an apparition, some figment of my imagination. He was a boy, a child who died in fear and confusion, lost and alone. But why was he still here? What did he want from me? I didn't know how to help him, didn't know what I could possibly do to make things right. But deep down, I felt a sense of duty, like it was up to me to bring him some sort of peace. As I sat alone in that cold, silent room, I promised myself that I would try to help him find what he was looking for. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't ignore him anymore. Not now that I knew his story. When I left the archive room that night, the building felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the halls emptier, and as I walked back to the ER, I felt that familiar chill. I had a terrible feeling that things were only going to get worse before they got better. But if Jacob was trapped here, reliving those final moments of fear and loneliness, then I couldn't just walk away. After learning Jacob's story, I felt both sorrow and urgency gnawing at me. I couldn't ignore him anymore. He was no longer just an eerie apparition but a lost soul, a boy trapped between worlds. I started talking to him, quietly, when I'd see him or even just sense him around. It felt strange at first, murmuring into the shadows, but the more I did it, the more natural it felt, and the more I felt him responding. It began with subtle signs. I'd whisper, "Jacob, I know you're here," and the lights in the hallway would flicker, or the air around me would grow noticeably colder. Once, I even heard a faint, shuffling sound behind me, like he was trying to reach out, but something held him back. Each time, my heart would race, my skin prickling with a mix of fear and sadness. It felt like he was struggling, trying to break through some invisible barrier. One night, I stayed late, determined to connect with him somehow. The ER was almost empty, the sterile white lights casting eerie shadows across the linoleum floors. I found myself in the waiting area, the very spot where I always saw him. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Jacob, I'm here. You don't have to be afraid." At first, there was silence. But then, a faint whisper drifted through the air, barely audible but unmistakably real. "She didn't come." The words sent a chill down my spine. It was his voice, thin and wavering, full of a sadness that felt suffocating. My heart ached for him, this little boy who had waited, alone and terrified, only to be met with silence. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him somehow. "Jacob, I know it's hard. I know you're scared, but you don't have to stay here anymore. I'm here to help you. I'll help you find peace." But as soon as I said the words, the atmosphere changed. The cold intensified, spreading through the room like an icy fog, and the light above me began to flicker violently. I felt a strange presence, something darker, lurking just beyond the shadows. It wasn't Jacob. I could feel the difference. This presence felt malicious, twisted, like it wanted to keep him trapped. My pulse quickened as the room grew even colder, and a faint sound reached my ears, the hollow echo of a woman's sobs. They were faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but they grew louder, echoing around the empty waiting area. It sounded like someone was in terrible pain, lost in endless grief. "Jacob," I called, my voice shaking. "Is that your mother?" Suddenly, he appeared, right in front of me this time, close enough that I could see the tear streaks on his cheeks, his haunted eyes wide with fear. He looked right at me, and in that moment, I felt the weight of all his pain, all his loneliness. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the shadows in the room began to swirl, gathering like a storm around him. I reached out instinctively, wanting to grab him, to pull him away from whatever force was trying to take him, but my hand passed right through him. He looked at me one last time, his face full of fear and desperation, before the shadows swallowed him, and he vanished again. The room went silent, the icy presence lifting as quickly as it had come. But I was left standing there, shaken and horrified, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was keeping Jacob here was more than just his memory of that tragic night. Something was holding him back, something that thrived on his pain and sorrow. I knew now that I had to do more than just understand his story. I had to find a way to free him, and I feared that, whatever I was up against, it wasn't going to let him go without a fight. The shadows were growing darker, the air colder every time Jacob appeared. I'd started to dread the waiting area, knowing I'd see him standing there, looking at me with those pleading eyes. But there was something else now, that twisted presence lurking just beyond the light, like a constant reminder that it wasn't done with him, or with me. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. I found myself reaching out to an old friend of mine, a pastor who was known for helping families with unusual grief and loss. I didn't tell him the whole story. I couldn't bring myself to sound like I'd gone completely mad. But he listened patiently, and before we hung up, he said something that stuck with me. "Sometimes, souls get bound by unresolved pain," he said gently. "And sometimes, it takes compassion to release them." I returned to work that night with a quiet determination. I brought with me a small candle from home, thinking that maybe a simple ritual would bring Jacob some comfort. The ER was quiet, and I waited until most of my colleagues had gone for the night before heading to the waiting area. I lit the candle and placed it on a small table, the tiny flame flickering in the dim light. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, trying to steady my own fear. "Jacob," I whispered softly, "I know you're scared, but it's time to let go. You don't have to stay here anymore." And then I waited, the room thick with silence. Slowly, I opened my eyes and saw him standing across from me, closer than he'd ever been before. He looked at the candle, his face softening, as if he understood that this was for him. "Your mom loves you, Jacob," I said, my voice breaking a little. "She never wanted you to be alone. She's waiting for you. You don't have to stay here anymore." His expression shifted, a mixture of sadness and relief, and for the first time, he took a step toward me. I felt that heavy, dark presence again, filling the room with its bitter cold, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I looked at Jacob and nodded, urging him to go on. In that moment, he reached out toward the candle, his small hand hovering over the flame, and as he did, a warm light filled the room, pushing back the shadows, pushing back that dark presence. The bitter cold lifted, replaced by a gentle warmth that wrapped around us like a soft embrace. Jacob looked at me one last time, his face peaceful, and then he was gone, fading into the light, taking the darkness with him. When the light finally dimmed and the room returned to normal, I sat there, exhausted yet filled with a quiet peace. I knew, somehow, that Jacob was finally free, and that he wouldn't haunt these halls anymore. For the first time in weeks, I went home and slept without nightmares. And when I returned to work the next night, the waiting area felt lighter, free of that lingering sorrow. Jacob was gone, at peace, and I could feel it in every quiet corner of that room. He had finally found his way home.